I'm Kate Conley. I'm Associate Dean of the Faculty for the Arts and Humanities at Dartmouth College, and I'm also a professor of French and comparative literature. And today I'm going to be speaking with Professor Ted Levin, who's the Parents Distinguished Research Professor of Music at Dartmouth, about his research and teaching. So your interests focus on music of Central Asia and Siberia. Could you talk a little bit about where that interest began and what it's about?
It started in the late 1970s when I was a graduate student at Princeton University, and I was fortunate to get a fellowship that allowed me to spend a year in Uzbekistan. That was during the Cold War. I was one of the first Americans to be able to go and do research there.
Did you specifically ask to go to Uzbekistan?
I did.
What prompted you to request that?
I'd had a long-standing interest in music of the East. I started as a pianist, but as a teenager went over the fence into Celtic folk music, and I simply kept going east. I went to Israel as a college student to pursue an interest in my own roots in Judaism, but to my surprise, what I discovered in Israel was not Judaism but Islam. And I started studying Islamic music in graduate school and have kept going with it.
Had you been to Uzbekistan before?
No, I'd never been there. It was hard to go to Uzbekistan in those years. You couldn't just get a plane ticket and go. I was one of a group of 35 American scholars who were the totality of the scholarly exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union in the social sciences and humanities in those years. So it was a long process, but I went, and it was a difficult year. It was the middle of the Cold War. My research project in Uzbekistan was centered on an indigenous repertory of classical music that was rooted in the mystical Sufi practices of Central Asia. And this was not something that was easy to study in the middle of the Cold War in Central Asia. And what I learned was that music is inextricably bound with politics and with cultural politics. And so I got interested in Soviet politics and the way that politics and in particular the cultural strategies that were developed by the Soviets have shaped artistic life and musical life.
And so this interest that started with music, moved to Islam, then to a geographic location, Islam in Central Asia.
Exactly.
And then came to encompass an appreciation for the way in which this musical tradition refracts political thought and political life. How do all these currents come out in the work that you do?
What I'm doing now is a form of what I would call scholarly activism. I'm an activist scholar. I not only do research, but I take part in international organizations that are working to build open societies, to build civil society in the region. And my own approach to that is working through the world of culture. I've been fortunate to be able to serve as a consultant for the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, which is part of a very large development network, the Aga Khan Development Network, that works in social, economic, and cultural development projects in some of the poorest parts of Africa and Asia. I also chair the Arts and Culture program of the Soros Foundation that's been active in supporting open society projects in Central Eurasia. What I'm trying to do is draw on the networks that I've been building for the last 30 years of musicians, of scholars, of various kinds of cultural activists, and to create projects throughout this region of Central Eurasia that help build and strengthen open societies. So what do you need to do that? You need, in a sense, autonomous cultural spaces that aren't tied to specific political ideologies or to the agendas of nation states to build their own identity through the manipulation of cultural heritage, but that really rely on the inspiration, the innovation of artists working as artists to represent what they want to do.
So you were describing how this interest began partly through the fellowship that you got to go to Uzbekistan, but the work you do with music from Central Asia has expanded to include several other countries. Could you just tell me what the names of some of those other countries are where you do this work?
I work in what you could call Greater Central Asia, which includes the so-called stans, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, also in the western region of China, Xinjiang province, which has a large population of Uyghurs who are Turkic-speaking and culturally very much linked to Uzbekistan.
And what about Siberia? Is that part of your
I've
work
also
too?
worked for about the last 20 years in Tuva, which is a tiny republic in the south of Siberia that's known for the unique music that's produced there that is called in the West throat singing.
And you've brought some of those singers to Dartmouth, haven't you?
Yes, last year for the Silk Road course that I taught, we had a group of throat singers, and they came to the class and they sang, and then we all went up to the barn, the converted barn where I live nearby, and we erected a yurt, the circular felt tent of the nomads, in my backyard with the students.
You mentioned the Silk Road project that you were teaching the students about. Weren't you the first director or one of the first directors of the Silk Road project that was founded by the cellist Yo-Yo Ma?
Yes, Yo-Yo read a book that I wrote about Central Asian music called The 100,000 Fools of God.
What a great title.
He got in touch with me and asked if I would work with him, and of course I was flattered and delighted, and I started working as a consultant, and after around a year he asked me if I would become the executive director.
I see.
Which I did, and I took 3.5 years off from Dartmouth to work with Yo-Yo Ma and the Silk Road project.
And can you describe a little bit more what that is?
We were looking at the Silk Road as what Yo-Yo has called the Internet of Antiquity. In other words, looking at the way that cultures become connected through transcultural trade and the movement of technology and fashion and music and culture.
So it's partly a metaphor.
Yes, it was a metaphor for the processes of cultural exchange that have had such a powerful influence on the evolution of culture throughout history. But our interest really was the historic Silk Road, starting in China and going overland to the Mediterranean. So we found musicians. My job was to go out and find the musicians who became part of the project. And I did a lot of traveling in the region. And at the end of the research phase, we started putting on Silk Road festivals around the world, the largest of which was on the National Mall in Washington, the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, that brought around 400 musicians and artisans and was visited by over 1 million people.
Wow, it's fantastic. So you were mentioning that you've taught the Silk Road Project in a course. Can you describe the course a little bit more? What kind of components were in it?
To learn about the Silk Road, you have to accept from the very start that it requires an interdisciplinary approach. The Silk Road was essentially a trade in luxury goods, but it involved exchanges of technology, exchanges of fashion, of art, of artisan work, of religion. So all of these elements have come into play in the teaching that I've done.
So history, geography, material culture, history of trade.
All of those, spiritual culture, expressive culture.
Visual culture,
Visual
material
culture, exactly. And of course, one person can't possibly be an expert on all of those things. So of course, I've invited a lot of guests, and we've had last year a wonderful group of artists, of musicians, of scholars, both from Dartmouth and from elsewhere, who have come to talk to the class. And we've covered a lot of these topics. It's taught in the college course rubric, which is an interdisciplinary rubric.
So do you co-teach it with someone else?
No, I'm the principal instructor, but
It's a stage-managed
It's kind of,
production.
yes, exactly, and we've had such wonderful participation from other faculty around the college who have contributed their time and expertise.
You seem to be describing various levels of listening. I mean, it starts with music, but it's also about listening to people talk about their lives and about history.
The work I do is ethnography, and that is precisely what's at the root of it. It's listening. And so when you start listening to people and hearing them tell their life stories, then it opens up a whole world that you can go into. And then there's various ways that you can try to represent that. Some people have made films, some people have made radio documentaries, some people have written books. I present concerts, I make recordings, I've written books. But I try to encourage my students to use their own interests and skills and talents and expertise to try to figure out how to both give back something from what they've learned and how to represent it through all of the possible media that we have at our disposal.
Is musical practice part of this course? Do students have an opportunity to experiment with new instruments or new ways of making music beyond learning how to listen and hear differences between points on the Silk Road?
This is not a specialized music course, so
Right.
there's not really time to do that. We have other courses, however, where I've brought musicians from Silk Road countries or who represent musical traditions of the Silk Road. And there, yes, the students learn. We had 2 years ago a wonderful Comanche player, a spike fiddle player from Iran, a famous performer called Kayhan Kalhor. And students in the class learned to play Iranian classical music. This year we have Ken Zuckerman coming from Basel Conservatory. He's an outstanding performer of Indian classical music, and students who take that course will learn to sing Indian ragas and play ragas on the sarod.
So for your Silk Road project, just one more last question about it. What kind of final project did the students do for that course? Did they have a final sort of culminating project?
There was a lot of reading, a lot of it focusing on travel writing, starting from the travels of Marco Polo and going up through Rory Stewart's recent chronicle of his trip across Afghanistan just after the Taliban rule ended, the places in between.
Right, I read that.
So students were asked to compare the way different writers in different epochs had chronicled their travels in Central Asia.
And what research are you doing right now that's an extension of this work that you've been doing for many years?
I've been working on a new book project that focuses on the cultural advocacy work that I've been doing with these NGOs, the Aga Khan Trust for Culture and the Soros Foundation and a couple of others, in which I'm really doing an ethnography of cultural development work, looking at the way that NGOs and the interventions that they bring with them are influencing the whole landscape of cultural development and dealing with issues about cultural heritage and the way that that's being dealt with in a number of these nations of Central Asia, and looking at how it's, in a sense, trying to create a roadmap for students. I think there's a lot of interest now among students in this kind of work. Students who major in anthropology or geography, regional studies, they don't necessarily want to become academics. They want to do some hands-on work. So here, what I'm trying to do is make a roadmap for these students, and on the basis of my own experience, theorize about how this work can be done, how you evaluate it, how you understand what the impact is of your interventions, and to look at some of the experiences of best practices of some of the projects, both very large ones and very small ones, that have had an extraordinary impact.
So that builds on the series of CDs that you've released in recent years.
I've been the executive producer of a 10-part series released by Smithsonian Folkways Recordings called Music of Central Asia. And what we're doing there is to look at the way traditions are being transformed by a younger generation of performers. We have a wonderful documentary filmmaker, young woman from Uzbekistan, who shoots documentary films about these musicians. They're part of the CD series. We do very high quality recordings. We have wonderful photographs that go with the CDs. And this whole package is meant to illuminate the kinds of cultural transformations that are taking place in the region.
Mm-hmm. So your new book is sort of a way of making sense of all of that and describing how you came to be in a position to create the CD series in a way. It's almost like a commentary about your career.
Well, it's not meant as autobiography. It's
Right.
really focusing on the work of these organizations. I present myself as a little bit of a fly on the wall, looking on into how decisions are made about the strategies of these organizations, and I've certainly had a role in making those strategies. So where I've played that role, I've been able to provide some description of what my thinking has been, and then look at the results. But I'm mainly focusing on a kind of organizational behavior as it applies to cultural development work.
Mm-hmm. Great. So can you tell me what you hope students will take away from studying with you and from your Silk Road course in particular?
In a word, a spirit of curiosity and adventurousness. I would love it if some of the students who have taken that course went to that part of the world and got engaged in some kind of project, of which there are so many opportunities now, and contributed all that they've learned at Dartmouth to helping people in that part of the world realize their potential to live full lives.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Ted.
Thank you, Kate.